Imagine standing on the biggest stage in sports, twice winning the ultimate prize, 2 Super Bowl victories, and being crowned Super Bowl MVP. You overcome every obstacle in your path, poverty, injury, and doubt, yet in the end you are erased from history. Jim Plunkett did all that, and somehow he's still ignored by the Hall of Fame. Why? For most, winning a Super Bowl is the pinnacle of achievement, the culmination of years of sacrifice and hard work. But for Jim Plunkett, that was only the beginning. A player who was told he didn't have what it took, who fought through relentless adversity, became one of the most unlikely champions the NFL has ever seen. Twice, he stood tall at the top of the football world, leading his team to victory when the odds were stacked against him. But despite this remarkable success, 2 Super Bowl rings, a Super Bowl MVP, and an unforgettable redemption story, Plunkett has been consistently overlooked by the very institution that is meant to honor greatness, the Pro Football Hall of Fame. How could a man who defied every expectation and proved his worth in the most high-pressure situations be so easily forgotten? What's even more baffling is that his story isn't just one of skill or luck. It's a story of resilience, of never giving up even when the world told him he was finished. Today, we'll uncover the story of Jim Plunkett, a man who should be remembered as one of the greatest to ever play the game but instead remains a shadow in NFL history. Born in San Jose, California in 1947, Jim Plunkett's life was shaped by circumstances most would call a disadvantage, but he turned them into his greatest strengths. Raised in a home where both of his parents, William and Carmen, were blind, Jim's early years were marked by a responsibility far beyond his peers. While other children spent their time playing outside, Jim had to shoulder the burden of helping his parents with everything, from grocery shopping to managing daily chores. His life wasn't one of carefree childhood moments. Instead, it was a life of constant work and a sense of maturity instilled in him from an early age. His early years weren't defined by privilege or luxury, but by a deep sense of duty. Jim didn't have the luxury of sports camps, private coaching, or expensive gear. What he had was his resilience, a quality that had been forged through the hardships he faced at home. Growing up in a family where survival was the daily task, he learned early on how to push through adversity, knowing that to make a better life for himself and his parents, he had to fight for it. But it wasn't just about his home life. Jim was always drawn to the world of sports. As a young boy, he dreamt of running track, his eyes set on Olympic glory, a dream that seemed both distant and tantalizing. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Football came calling, and for Jim, it was an opportunity that would change everything. Though the path to the NFL seemed impossible, Jim's inner drive and work ethic quickly turned him into a standout athlete. One who was determined to not only escape his circumstances but redefine them. In high school, Jim didn't stand out as a star athlete, not immediately at least. He wasn't the flashiest or the most athletically gifted player on the field. But Jim had something that was often more important: grit. Where others faltered, he pushed forward. He spent countless hours practicing, honing his skills, improving his game, and gaining strength and agility that would set him apart. He wasn't just trying to make the team, he was trying to make a mark on the game. Every setback became fuel for his fire. Eventually, his dedication paid off. Stanford University saw something in Jim that many others had overlooked, a quiet brilliance that was impossible to ignore. They offered him a scholarship, and that offer was the moment his life began to change. Stanford, a school that wasn't necessarily known for producing NFL quarterbacks at the time, was about to become the stage for Jim's meteoric rise. At Stanford, Jim was no longer a hidden gem. He was thrust into the spotlight, where his natural abilities began to shine. It wasn't just his physical skills, it was his leadership, his undeniable resilience, and his unshakable belief that he could succeed against all odds. His performance on the field spoke volumes. He led Stanford to its first ever Rose Bowl victory and became the school's first Heisman Trophy winner. In 1970, Jim didn't just play well, he made history. But what was perhaps most impressive about Jim's early success wasn't his Heisman win or his record-breaking stats. It was how he carried himself off the field. Despite being thrown into a high-pressure environment, Jim never let the spotlight change him. He never lost sight of the lessons from his childhood, always remembering the hard work and sacrifice that had brought him to that point. He remained humble, focused on the next challenge, never content to rest on his laurels. It wasn't enough to be a great player. Jim wanted to be a leader, someone who would inspire others to believe in themselves. From those early days, Jim Plunkett proved that greatness wasn't born from perfect circumstances. It was the product of grit, determination, and the refusal to quit, even when the odds were against you. His journey had just begun, and while the path ahead would be filled with obstacles, one thing was certain: Jim Plunkett was destined for greatness. Jim Plunkett's journey from a challenging childhood in San Jose to the bright lights of the NFL was nothing short of extraordinary. From the time he entered Stanford University, Jim had shown flashes of brilliance, record-breaking performances, leadership, and a determined spirit that set him apart from others. But it was his transition to the NFL that would truly define his legacy. And when that moment came, Jim was ready. In 1971, after leading Stanford to its first ever Rose Bowl victory and claiming the Heisman Trophy, Jim Plunkett was drafted first overall by the New England Patriots. As the #1 overall pick, the expectations were sky high. NFL scouts, sports writers, and fans alike had their eyes on him. The journey Jim had taken from a humble, hard-working childhood to national acclaim was impressive, but now he was about to face the ultimate test: the NFL. Despite entering a struggling Patriots team, Jim's sheer talent was undeniable. The Patriots were in desperate need of a quarterback who could lead them to victory, and while Jim was thrown into a system that couldn't protect him, his resilience and ability to rise above adversity began to shine through. In his rookie season, despite being sacked 37 times, the most in the league, Jim showed flashes of greatness. Though his team wasn't good and he had little protection, Jim didn't back down. His fierce will to succeed, born from a lifetime of struggle, allowed him to remain calm under pressure. He wasn't just throwing the ball, he was learning, adapting, and constantly improving. It was this unshakable drive that began to make people take notice. While the Patriots remained at the bottom of the standings, Jim's individual performance, his poise, leadership, and ability to make plays when his team needed it most, caught the attention of the NFL. By his second season, it was clear Jim Plunkett wasn't just another quarterback, he was becoming a force. But it wasn't just about the statistics. It was about the impact he had on the field. Jim's ability to read the game, his confidence under pressure, and his incredible arm strength turned him into a nightmare for opposing defenses. No longer just a product of his team's struggles, Jim Plunkett was emerging as one of the league's most exciting and dangerous quarterbacks. As Jim continued to hone his craft, the Patriots began to realize they had something special on their hands. His play was dynamic, and his leadership was the spark the team needed. While the Patriots didn't reach the heights of championship glory during Jim's early years, he became a rising star in a league where his talents were undeniable. But as Jim's career in New England began to shine, he was soon dealt another blow. The team's inability to build around him meant that his growth was stunted. Injuries and a lack of consistent support kept him from reaching his full potential with the Patriots. By 1976, the Patriots, now frustrated with their inability to rise from the bottom of the standings, traded Jim to the San Francisco 49ers in hopes of giving him a fresh start. However, the 49ers weren't much better. The injuries continued to plague Jim, and his role as the starting quarterback was fleeting. The physical toll of playing in the NFL, combined with a lack of team stability, made it clear that Jim was on the decline. But the worst was yet to come. By 1978, after multiple seasons marred by injuries and a lack of support, Jim found himself out of football. Once a first overall pick, a Heisman winner, and a champion in college, Jim was now seen as a has-been, a forgotten player whose best days were behind him. At just 30 years old, his NFL career seemed over. The dream of championship glory had slipped through his fingers, and with it, his identity as one of the game's brightest quarterbacks. The NFL had moved on, leaving Jim in its wake. For someone who had once been a beacon of hope for a failing franchise, this moment felt like the ultimate betrayal. How could someone who had achieved so much, defied so many odds, be cast aside so easily? Jim had given it all to the NFL, only to have his name fade into obscurity. In a world that constantly seeks the next big thing, Jim Plunkett was suddenly left behind. The turning point had come. The NFL had moved on without him, and Jim's name was no longer in the spotlight. No longer viewed as the future of the league, he was now just another former first overall pick whose name faded into the background. But what no one could see was that Jim wasn't done yet. This moment of decline wasn't the end of his story, it was the catalyst for what would become one of the greatest comebacks the NFL has ever witnessed. The fall from grace was swift and unforgiving. Jim Plunkett, the player who had once been hailed as the future of the NFL, suddenly found himself on the outside looking in. After being traded from the Patriots to the 49ers and ultimately out of football by 1978, it seemed like everything Jim had worked for was slipping away. A former #1 overall pick, a Heisman winner, and an NFL quarterback whose potential was once limitless, now just a forgotten figure, cast aside by the league that once relied on him. It left him with emotional wounds that were even harder to heal. As he battled through the darkness of obscurity, the resentment of being forgotten by the very sport he had given everything to, Jim's future seemed uncertain. But even in his lowest moments, he never lost the fire that had driven him to greatness. Deep down, Jim knew that his story wasn't over, it was just waiting for a second chance. In 1980, that moment arrived. Dan Pastorini, the starting quarterback for the Raiders, was injured. Suddenly, the stage was set for Jim to make his return. It was his second chance, but this time, it wasn't about proving the doubters wrong. It was about proving to himself that he could still be the player he once was, and more. Jim didn't just step in as the backup. He took control. The Raiders weren't just looking for a quarterback to fill a hole. They needed a leader. And Jim, the man who had once been overlooked and cast aside, was now ready to lead. In Super Bowl 15, Jim Plunkett stepped onto the field not just as a quarterback, but as a man on a mission. The world hadn't seen him in years, but now they couldn't take their eyes off him. He threw for 261 yards and 3 touchdowns, leading the Raiders to a 27-10 victory over the Philadelphia Eagles. And when the final whistle blew, Jim had achieved the ultimate redemption: Super Bowl MVP. For the first time in years, the NFL couldn't ignore Jim. The man who had been written off, the man who had fought for his career like few others had risen again. The comeback story was no longer a distant dream, it was real and it was unforgettable. The NFL world took notice. Jim Plunkett was no longer forgotten, he was remembered as one of the most resilient and determined quarterbacks to ever play the game. But Jim's redemption didn't stop with Super Bowl 15. He would go on to lead the Raiders to another championship in 1983, cementing his legacy with a second Super Bowl win and another MVP award. His second chance had come at a time when many had written him off, but Jim had never stopped believing that he could still leave his mark on the game. Jim's return wasn't just about football, it was about closure. After years of being overlooked, forgotten, and cast aside, he had shown the world that even the most broken of careers could be rebuilt. Redemption was not just a return to form, it was a reclamation of his place in history. Jim Plunkett's legacy was no longer defined by his fall, but by his resilience and his refusal to quit. And in the end, Jim found peace. Not just on the football field, but in knowing that his story would never be forgotten again. Jim Plunkett's return to glory with the Oakland Raiders wasn't just a remarkable comeback, it was a statement. A statement to the world that greatness cannot be erased, even when the spotlight fades. Jim's career had been marked by adversity and setbacks, yet he still managed to achieve what most would consider impossible: 2 Super Bowl victories, 2 MVPs, and the undeniable respect of his peers. But in the years that followed, Jim's name remained on the fringes of NFL history, never fully embraced by the Hall of Fame, never given the honor and recognition he deserved. Many of the greatest NFL players are lost to time, their stories never fully told or celebrated. Jim's journey symbolizes the often overlooked heroes, those who quietly redefined the game, who pushed through the pain and obstacles to become champions, only to be forgotten when the next generation takes over. It's a harsh reality in a world where statistics and big personalities often overshadow the true essence of a player's impact. Jim Plunkett's story is a stark reminder of how many of the NFL's greatest legends fade into obscurity. Despite 2 Super Bowl victories, 2 MVPs, and a career that exemplified resilience and determination, Jim was never fully celebrated the way he deserved. His legacy, like so many others, reminds us that the NFL sometimes forgets its heroes. Those who have given everything to the game only to be overlooked when the spotlight moves on. But Jim's story doesn't have to be forgotten. It's time to keep the memory alive. So, let's take a moment to reflect. Who else deserves the recognition they've been denied? Who are the players whose contributions have shaped the NFL, yet remain on the sidelines of history? We want to hear from you. Drop their names in the comments below. Let's celebrate the players who, like Jim Plunkett, changed the game but never received the accolades they truly earned. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if Jim's story made you think about the forgotten heroes in the NFL, and let's keep their legacies alive together.